Hello, everyone. This is Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and this is part 2 of the copycat variation of the Petroff defense. This will be the copycat variation in action. As usual, these games are my games. All of them are correspondence chess, so this means both players have many hours and days to think about each move. And we will get right into the action here. The first opponent is 1800. We will actually show quite a number of games here because a lot of these games are short, which is even better advertisement for this particular defense. Not only do we have the ability to diffuse the advantage of White's first move by getting into a number of end games, but we also have the ability to obtain miniature victories, victories that are 25 moves or less. So here's example one of that. This particular opponent's rated 1800, and here we have the copycat variation. Knight takes e4, queen to e2, queen to e7. So all of this has been seen before. Queen takes knight, d6. And in this first game, we will see in the first two games, we will see some strategies involving f4, holding on to the pawn in a aggressive way. Here, of course, we must collect the knight, d takes, and f5 as recommended. White, of course, here has many moves with the queen. We will just simply take a look at the move that was played, which was queen to d5. Of course, you know, a very aggressively placed and blocking out kingside castling, but obviously this queen is quite a target here on d5. So here first we make a target of the e5 pawn. Bishop to b5 is a pin, and as usual, we almost always block this pin with the bishop, like so. Bishop to d7, d4. So again, trying very hard to hold on to all of the pieces, and we just simply castle. Now, this, of course, is setting up bishop to e6, which will force the queen away from the d4 pawn, in which case knight takes d4. So that's the first threat in the position. Here, White tried to back off the queen straight away, and bishop to e6 came in anyway. So queen c4, putting the queen on d5 actually set up this position. And now all of a sudden the d4 pawn is collapsing, which means black will get their pawn back and have just a completely dominating position. As it was, White played queen to c5. Now, this, of course, is offering the pawn back in addition to a queen trade just by simply taking twice on c5. However, here, the reality is much worse because after queen to h4, White resigned. This is simply giving check, and it's also attacking the queen at the same time. If White flicks in g3 to block the check and also hit the queen, Black has the very simple queen to e4 check, and everything is dropping here. So this was an extremely quick victory. Now, of course, for this one to have occurred, the queen was placed on an extremely bad square on d5, but it kind of shows the power of Black's setup here with queenside castling and quick development, that this, White has to take some care in how they develop their pieces. All right, so back it up a few moves. In another game, against a totally different 1800 player, this player played queen to e3, which of course looks a lot more logical. It's keeping the queen out of the range of the black pieces and still holding on to the extra pawn. All right, so this game also featured knight to c6, bishop to b5 with the pin. We break the pin with bishop to d7, also preparing castling, and White castles themselves. All right, so here is a situation where it looks like that we can grab e5, but on knight captures e5, White can actually flick in bishop takes d7 check. And not only does this exchange off, Black's potentially really good bishop, it also undermines the support of the f5 pawn. So in this particular case, we cannot take the e5 pawn right away. So instead, I played queen c5, which is, again, thematic to these types of positions. We do not mind the queen trade because the minor pieces and our rooks that are left behind will be superior to their counterparts. And this is one example of this. Here, white exchanged queen since there was also an attack on the bishop. Bishop takes his check, king to h1. And now we simply castle. Again, I think taking on e5 might be a little bit of a mistake, also due to the fact that white can just simply take on d7 with check, and then quite possibly take the pawn on f5, although there are some technical details here. Instead, I've just simply played castles right away. And one of those technical details did come up with the move c3. So this, of course, is threatening knight, a pawn to d4, holding onto the pawn forever. And now black must recollect the pawn. Now here's where the technical detail will come in, because after white takes with check and black captures with the knight to avoid the d4 fork, here it looks like that rook takes f5 can be played. However, after rook takes f5, there, I believe, might be a very quick rook f8. Rook takes pawn, rook to f8, and because the back rank is quite weak, this means that black will have some pressure left for the pawn, just simply due to the fact that the bishop, the knight, and the rook that remains will be much better than their counterpart temporarily. All right, so because of this, this is why I believe white played d4 first. So we have to back up the bishop. And in this position, it's the same thing. If rook takes the free pawn, then the rook will challenge on the f file. And after the trade of rooks, black will have temporarily better pieces than their counterparts. So again, white tries to, develop the pieces much quicker than normal. And after capture and capture, now we get time to actually defend this pawn like so. So we have an end game where we have even material, but it's the quality of pieces that really matters. This knight is probably slightly better than this knight. The rook in the corner is probably worse than this rook in the corner, because this rook will, of course, achieve their dream position in one move. The king is even better than the counterpart, since white is stuck in the corner. So this endgame we have every reason to play on here. Knight to a3, developing a piece, but developing it onto the side. And of course, now black achieves, their ideal piece placement here. Rook f2, preventing rook to e2. Knight to b6 actually prevents knight to c4. So white doubles rooks on this file, hoping probably to get g4 in. Rook to e4, which not only prepares doubling, it also stops any g4 ideas temporarily. Knight to b1, doubling rooks, knight to d2. And here black invaded with rook to e2. And on knight to f3, invaded with knight to c4. This seems kind of worse than knight to c4, but the point to knight to a4 is that not only are we double attacking b2, but if white tries to push the pawn, suddenly c3 is falling. So this is suddenly a very nice endgame move to have. White cut off the rook, but of course there's a double attack on b2, so we can actually capture. So now we end up a pawn ahead in an endgame. After knight takes, rook to b1, the knight went back to a4 to gain another tempo. Rook to b3 defends, and then a nice little technical move here, knight to c5. So here, of course, if white captures the knight, we capture this knight, and we're a pawn up in a rook and pawn endgame, and white will have weak pawns all over the place. In addition to having a weak back rank, white tried rook to b5 to win the knight in a different way, and the knight just simply backed up, offering a trade. And of course, if white does trade, then instead of taking the knight back, we have an immediate checkmate. So this means that there's going to be a forced trade on e5 here after h4 making heir for the king, just simple capture of the knight. And here white resigned, probably maybe a little bit early, but at the same time, even if white just avoids the rook trade and captures like this and acquires a passed pawn, the weakness of the pawn and the fact that the pawns and the fact that black is up a pawn here gives black excellent winning chances, and evidently the opponent did not want to see the rest of this. Okay, so this is a couple examples of the f4 move. Here's another one. Knight takes queen e2, queen e7, queen takes d6, d4 first, capture, capture. And then on knight c6, this opponent, who is rated 1950, played f4 in this position. So this is after d4 first and then f4. As mentioned, bishop to g4 is the best move, again, preparing castling. And the opponent here played knight c3, which is yet another way to guard the sensitive d1 square, so that after castles, black is not immediately threatening rook to d1. So here is probably the most logical way to guard this. Now, many moves, of course, are possible here. White in this game played bishop to e2, trying to trade off the bishop, which I agreed to. Queen takes. And this, I felt, gives black a very quick initiative with knight to d4, and on queen to f2, which not only saves the queen, but also protects c2, black has the move queen c5, a very irritating move. This move is actually multi-purpose. Number one, it actually releases the bishop so that it can go to e7, so that we can continue on with normal development with bishop to e7 and rook he8, and eventually the powerful f6 move opening up the e file. The second thing that it does is that it actually prevents castling, because in this position, after castle, black has the very nifty knight takes c2. We have a pin here, so the knight can't be captured. And of course, if they trade queens, we just simply capture back. And we have, again, an even endgame. Actually, it's not an even endgame, because after bishop c5 check, we could simply pick up the rook. So this is a nice little trick here, preventing castling. The other trick, of course, here is that if white tries to double up on the knight, then black again has knight takes c2 check, which will double attack here on the bishop on e3. And if white captures the knight, then we could capture the bishop with check, which is something that happens a little later in the game. So queen c5 actually puts a lot of pressure on white to come up with something good. Here they came up with a3, which might be a case of, oh, I just need to find a good legal move. So that's what happened. Having no tactic to land right away, we just simply develop a piece. H3, this I think is not quite so good. This weakens this diagonal terribly. Again, I think white is waiting for some action to happen here, so is playing waiting moves, but this is a little too weakening. So here, after rook he8, we have completed development, and for our pawn sacrifice, I think that black has got quite a lot of pressure here. Like I said, generally speaking, in these lines, black will get a lot of good central play with their pieces. And of course, we're trying to play f6 and open up the e file as well. So this is looking really good. G3, I mean, that also blocks out some bishop h4 ideas. But again, white is not developing pieces and is loosening their position on every move. So we simply play f6 and hit white where they are weakest. White tried eventually this bishop to e3 move, but like I mentioned a few moves ago, this is actually a tactic involving knight takes c2. So with all kinds of a fork here, here, and here, white pretty much has to take. And then when black takes on e3, this position, of course, is clearly superior for black. We got our pawn back, and all our pieces are perfectly placed. And as soon as the e file gets ripped open, this will just be game over. After knight to e2, bishop to c5 already threatens checkmate. So white has to play rook f1 to defend this. And then just simply capturing, just simply threatening capturing, capture, just capture until they resign. And after queen to c3, trying to trade queens, I flicked in rook d3, queen c2, and then just simply open the e file. And here white threw in the towel. There really is, nothing really to speak of here. And black has a model of coordination in this position. So, this feature, all of this features the early f4 type strategies. Okay, so strategy number 2 is, we'll go copycat variation like this. Queen takes d6, and here again we will we'll all the rest of the games will feature this position. And after capture and capture with the pawn, like so, we'll take a look at knight c6. Okay, so there's a couple of moves here. We'll besides f4, and that one of them is bishop to b5 and the other is knight to c3. Let's look at bishop to b5 in action first. Okay, so here we have bishop to d7. Of course, we need to be able to castle. We need to protect the knight. Here, knight c3 is perfectly normal and good and the best move. And this is where black has the choice of castling queenside or queen to b4. So first, we'll take a look at castle queenside. This happened in 2 of my games. One of them featured castles right away. And here we played a6 to make white decide what they want to do with the bishop. I should point out that moves like queen takes e5, getting the pawn back in this normal fashion, actually loses to the move bishop takes knight, and this removes the guard of the queen, and the bishop is magically guarding our own queen. So this actually wins a piece. So there are opportunities to take e5, but sometimes they're tactically wrong. For the same reason, I believe knight takes e5 also runs into knight d5, followed by bishop to f4, which is basically crushing for white. So this is why a6 was chosen. And this position was reached twice. In one game, white actually backed up, and then we collected the pawn, since we actually win the pawn back and actually attack the bishop. And here the opponent, who was rated 1800, actually found a really nice resource, which is the move bishop takes a6. Now here, of course, if the bishop is accepted, then white suddenly has queen a8 mate. So we cannot accept this bishop. So what we must do is play bishop to c6. And here, if white wants, white can actually can force a draw by just the simple move queen to f5. If queen to f5, then black is forced to keep up the tension by playing bishop to d7. If black actually gets out of this check in any other way, then white will just simply back up the bishop and just be a pawn ahead as normal, except this one is the a pawn is missing, and that means that the king will be weak. So this means that black actually has to attack the queen. White again threatens checkmate, and then black plays bishop c6, and there's the draw. Queen f5, bishop d7, queen e4, bishop c6, and repetition. So kind of an unfortunate reality that even though this looks like an exciting position, that white can force a draw in this particular variation. So this is good to know. In the game, white, my opponent actually played bishop takes bishop, which is just simply losing to king takes bishop, and white has no attack here, and I later went on to win the game. So this was just a simple faulty combination, but queen f5 does in fact force a draw. In another game, when a6 happened, this particular opponent, who was rated 1635, so a little bit lower rated opponent, actually took on c6 right away. And when we captured back with the bishop, played queen g4 check, king b8, and a bishop to f4. Now this again is a strategy trying again to develop and hold on to the pawn. But because we have such a monster bishop and a monster rook, and basically some pieces in reserve that also can go on good squares, Black has excellent compensation for the pawn here. Here I chose to go for a kingside pawn storm since all these pieces are sitting here waiting to be tempoed on. Queen to e2. This one is being tempoed on. And then bishop to g7 happened, so that now this pawn is under attack, and we've got some really good pieces aiming in all kinds of directions. Holding on to the pawn. And here, this move was played. I was trying to trick him into possibly taking the H pawn so that this way the H file could be opened up again. He did not fall for this trick on the first move. He actually also centralized, but then when I captured my pawn back, he then bit on h5, which of course runs right into rook to h8. And now here we've got a wonderful rook, we got a wonderful bishop, we got a extremely good bishop, we've got a really good rook, and all it really leaves us is to put our queen on some really great square. So first they have to save their queen, and of course here we could pick up a pawn with check, and now we have material equality, but it's just who's got the better position. In my opinion, black is really doing well here, and white is massively uncomfortable with the king sitting here on f1. So queen c5. Now this phase of the game, basically, I was just trying to maneuver around to try to get white to weaken themselves. So I'm not laying claim to that any of these moves are perfect at this point, but we're just simply trying to get white to make some sort of last weaken, some sort of weakness that we could try to take advantage of. Here, white hits the queen, and then a tricky move here. So this way, of course, if the queen is captured, the rook h1 is mate. So, and it also saved the bishop. So there's a weakness that we can play against. So obviously putting a bishop here on g3 will bother the king. So we have many moves with the queen. I chose queen f5, trying maybe to try to play g4. Queen d3 offering a queen trade, and I really did not want to trade queens in this game, or in this position. So I played queen a5, not the most ideal post for the queen, but it does avoid the trade. Queen back to e2, and then rook d e8. And in this position, my opponent actually resigned, which of course is a tad early, but I mean, with all of these pieces just so wonderfully placed, and a possible can opener in the form of g4, I mean, this is rather unpleasant to defend. But I mean, we don't have to resign at this moment, but the opponent chose to do so. So this was just a nice little victory here. Okay, now backing up a few moves, there is the queen b4 move, and after d6, d4, capture, pawn takes, knight c6, bishop b5, bishop d7, knight c3, queen, not castles, which is the other move. There is this move, queen to b4. Okay, so this again is trying hard to trade queens. In one game against a 1900 player, we actually did see queen takes queen. And after bishop takes and f4 holding on to the pawn, seemingly, now because there is no tactic involving the queens being lined up on the e file, now we can actually play the tactic knight takes e5. So this leads to an endgame. And in fact, white can choose any endgame they want to play, but black did get their pawn back and has a reasonable, a good position and at least equality here. In this particular game, white actually castled, which allowed remove the guard tactic. This thing's not defended anymore. Bishop takes, and since this is attacked, we have to take with the knight, or at least this is what I thought. And then after b takes and castles, bishop e3 and rook h e8, In my opinion, black has a clearly superior endgame here. All the pieces are well placed. White has got a number of pawn weaknesses, and the bishop isn't quite so wonderful here on e3. By the way, taking on a7 should lose to b6, and the bishop is trapped. And so I won't show the rest of the game here, but I eventually won a very long game in the end game. But this position, in my opinion, is clearly maybe not clearly superior for black, but I mean, it's at least slightly better. I mean, black's got the better chances here. Okay, so in another queen to b4 game against a 2100 player, he played queen to f4. And this, of course, is going to put some pressure on f7 just in case black tries to castle, which I did anyway. So here, if he wants to capture, the idea is that on takes, we have the move bishop c5 followed by putting a rook on f8 with some irritating pressure. Also, there will be some cases where if white takes on f7, then we'll be able to take on e5. Okay, but he does not do this. He actually safeguards his king. I asked him what he wants to do with the bishop, and he chose to keep the initiative by taking. And now he has some chances of taking on f7, but again, the f file will get opened up. And again, we have this wonderful bishop on c6 that's dictating what white can do because the knight can't go anywhere forward because of him. And also he's looking at the king. So this is great. So queen f5 is check, which basically compels king to b8. a3, give me the queen. And here we played queen c4. No real reason for this. I mean, I guess it kind of slows down any pawn pushes, and it does keep some eye on the rook just in case we need this. It also defends f7. So it's kind of a good all-purpose move here. Queen c4. Bishop g5 says, give me the rook. And now we have to do something drastic. So the drastic move we chose is f6. So this is, again, sacrificing a pawn, but this is going to open up the g, f, e, and d files, or at least half open them, so that of course, if bishop takes, then we could play rook to g8, and that is threatening the windmill on g2. So he won't have time to take the rook on f6. So here he takes with the queen instead. So white again is now up 2 pawns, but after bishop to d6, so that the rooks defend themselves, here we've got we've got some really good looking pieces heading this way and really good chances to play for mate. Even the queen is well placed here on c4. f3, so trying to slow this down. Give me the queen. No. And then let's just simply improve all of our pieces. Queen takes h7 is met by rook takes bishop. So king to h1, trying to get out of any possible checks on c5. Rook to g6. Can I have your queen, please? He says no. And then it only left to play one more good move, and I felt like this was game over. Black probably has more than one good move in this position. I chose queen g8. Very interesting retreating move, simply doubling up on the g bishop. And then when he defended the bishop, we just simply attacked him one more time. And here white resigned because once the bishop moves and black is allowed to play rook takes g2, there will not be much of a defense to that particular attack. So this is already game over. Okay. So all right, so that features queen to b4. Now, the next game, we will look at what happens when white trades queens early. So take, queen e2, queen e7, queen takes knight, d6, d4, pawn takes, and queen takes. So what does this look like in action? Well, all right, so like I said, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, bishop f5, good move, attacking here. And the shorter of the two games, this was against a 1700 player, featured bishop to d3. And on bishop to d3, we should always take this guy because on knight c6, we are attacking the pawn, but as mentioned in the previous video, we are also threatening knight to b4. So after in this particular game, white played f4, trying to defend the pawn in the most economical way, but on knight to b4, there are two threats. Now, in the shortest game that I had, the 1700 player thought that the major attack was on d3, so he simply played d4 to defend himself and was surprised to learn that this one won a rook. So here he resigned. Not everybody's going to fall for this one. As a matter of fact, the second time around when we had this position against an 1810 player, he played king to d2. So this guards c2 and it guards d3. However, after the very simple castles, there is no more defense to the d pawn, and black will actually get their pawn back by force. And white was basically forced to put their king on a very awkward square, and will have to continue to keep moving him around to keep him safe. Okay, so this game was a little bit longer, so let's get into it. A3, knight takes d3, winning the pawn back, and now we have discovery powers. So he gets out of the way. Bishop c5. This is almost always the great spot for the bishop in this line. Rook to d1, trying to take the knight. So we exchange off the undeveloped bishop with check, and then we play this to make a tactical threat, which was blocked very easily. And then rook h to e8. And here, once again, we have our ideal piece placement, and we are all ready to play f6 and rock and roll on the center files here. White gets out of the way. A6 was played, maybe not completely necessary, but I thought knight b5 was an irritating move, so let's just at least take that move away. Rook a b1, trying to get out of all this lineup. F6, we do this anyway. And then pawn takes. So here, of course, we probably should take with the bishop just to keep our pawn structure in good shape. But I flicked in rook e3 check first, forcing him up the board, and then took. So now his king is a little bit drafty. We don't have quite the right pieces to go after the king, seemingly, but at the very least, we can trap the king on the king side. G3, trying to hold stuff together. Rook d2, attacking. King f5, improving the king somewhat. And I believe that if I thought the idea was that if I take on h2, that he'll have knight to d5 as a move, which will double attack the c pawn and attack the rook and attack the bishop. So he basically is daring me to take h2, but of course we see the whole point of this. b5, probably not the most accurate move. I was trying to get rid of like the knight a4, knight b6 possibilities or something like that, and trying to keep the knight a little bit more uncomfortable. But okay, so h4, rook dd3. So the idea here is that we're double attacking this and we're triple attacking the c3 knight. So he has to do something, and he played knight to e4, which is a clear blunder. Now here we can use a couple of distraction tactics to win the knight. First, we check him. And then on king to e6, we can utilize this pin by actually giving another check, rook d6. So this can't be captured. And, and after king to f5, here's where the king gets overloaded or distracted away from the knight. We play g6. King can't take because it's protected. And it's checked, so the knight can't capture anything, but he has to walk away. Then we throw in an in-between move, give him another check and force him over here to never land, and then collect the knight. So this is already a winning position. The rest of the game was just spent trying to make a mating net for the king. Rook c2, improving the king first. And then we start aiming some stuff at the king. Let's keep the queen side closed. Here he says, give me the pawn. So we say no. Bishop to e1, give me the g3 pawn. He says no. Rook to e2, trapping the king so that he can't run. Rook to e5, kind of a tricky move here, because here, of course, if we play rook takes rook, he plays pawn takes rook, and suddenly we'll be in a nasty fork. So that's kind of cool. So here we have to use the X-ray tactic in order to defend ourselves. rook c5, rook 6 to e3, again setting up rook takes pawn checkmate, so he has to defend. Rook d3, rook takes pawn, and rook d2. So this again is setting up rook to h2 mate. Rook to d1 actually pins this, but rook to h2 is mate. So this was the end to this particular game. Okay, so that was what happens if they trade queens. Now let's go back to this position. So this is after bishop to f5. In another game, this particular opponent was rated 1500, so we're a much lower rated player. c3 was played, just simply guarding the pawn in the best way and also preventing knight c6 to b4 or knight c6 to d4. All right. Nevertheless, we play knight to d7. So again, we can't play knight c6 when bishop b5 is an annoying pin, but this one is better, attacking here. Again, the most useful way to defend the pawn. And here, bishop c5 actually looks like kind of a good move, although maybe white can start pushing him around with queenside pawn storm. So here we just simply castle. And then bishop to e3 was played. And now, I kind of wish that I played bishop c5 on the previous move, just because this was, here to prevent that. But nevertheless, we can still stick with the same plan, which is to rip open the E and D files. So f6 actually does that, since we're putting a lot of pressure on e5. So white takes and black takes, and now there it is. The files are wide open. And in this position, white played knight to d2. And this turns out to be a clear blunder. And the reason for this is because of the simple pin, rook to e8. And the question is, how do we defend the bishop? If king to f2, then knight to g4. And that wins the e3 bishop. Here, white tried knight to c4. And here we have to be a little bit careful. Here it seems like we should play b5 and kick the knight away, but then the knight will just perch itself on e5. And then we have a little bit harder time collecting what we want. So the better move is to simply develop a piece and pig pile on the bishop like this. And again, we're getting model coordination. And after the moves king to e3 and sacrificing, here, white has to take with the knight, and after rook to d8 check, white has no good move in the position. If king to e2, then the rook will just double back to e8, and again, we'll have a pig pile on the knight, and black will have a strong central force in addition to having material extra. Here, white blundered with bishop to d3, and black just simply took on d3 with check, and then we could take this on the next move, and we have three pieces for a rook, which is too big of an advantage to play on. So here white resigned. Okay, so that will that shows off what happens with when they exchange off queens. Okay, so back in this position, let's go back to the diagram. So of course here pawn takes is the main move, and knight c6, and then we have the move knight c3, which I mentioned in the previous video is probably white's best move. Now, fortunately for me, I have not yet faced the main idea after queen takes pawn, queen takes queen, knight takes, knight to b5, good move, bishop to b4. I have not yet faced bishop to d2. So I have no experience yet on what kind of ending that is, although I guess I suppose I can look forward to that. The opponents that I have had in this position have all played c3, which of course allows for bishop to a5, and now we have a much more natural way to defend the c pawn without having to use our king. Bishop to f4, give me the knight, and f6 simply defending it. Now, it's true that at some point white can capture the knight, and black will be forced to capture back and give themselves an isolated king pawn, which isn't the greatest pawn in the world. But at that moment, black will also have the bishop pair, which will compensate nicely for the weakness of that pawn. So we're not worried too much about that. Castles, very logical move. And here we had this position a couple times. And as I mentioned in the previous video, in my opinion, King F7 is worth a go, because on King F7, we are preparing a very quick rook to E8 and getting this rook into the game much quicker than we can if they play bishop to E6, which I tried in one game. Now this one, it was also a short game, but I do not feel that black actually had anything good here. So like see King B1, kick the knight, knight to D4. Here we play bishop to F7. And now we can see, because we haven't moved our king out to F7, that the H8 rook is a little bit stuck. Okay, and this opponent, who was rated 1660, actually went for some pressure. So he isolates the pawn and then immediately targets him. So I let this pawn go with castles. I mean, I felt like we had to develop somehow. Rook takes pawn, not only wins a pawn, but wins a tempo. And it was here that I think where I actually made a big mistake. Here I should just simply retreat the bishop. I decided to flick in bishop to G6 check, expecting king to A1, which would make the king extremely weak temporarily. However, he played king C1, which actually is a good move, although it ends up hurting him in the end. But it is a good move here. So now that we saved the bishop, the other point is that the bishop that was on F7 was actually doing something, and that was, it was guarding the E6 square. So here my opponent chose to use this square, and this already gives white something of an advantage with the extra pawn and these extra tempi that they're gaining as well. Now black does have reasonable development, and you know, we still have the two bishops, but we have to start playing for tricks. Now here white chose to grab this pawn. This might have been a little too early. Probably white should have developed a piece first. Instead, we played this move, which actually threatens checkmate. So we completed development and threatened mate at the same time. Bishop to C4 guards the mate. Rook to D2 is threatening rook to C2, which is slightly unpleasant. Also rook to F2 maybe. Rook to E2 guards this. Taking, and we at least collect one pawn back. So even here, we are down a pawn in the endgame, but the pair of bishops really do matter. Although I would say that this position is still a touch better for white. Unfortunately, white blundered here with rook to D1, which looks like a reasonable move until you see bishop to E3. And here's the power of the two bishops, especially on an open board. Not only is the rook lost, but the king is lost as well, for the most part. So this was a fortunate end to a game where I don't feel like black was better there. So that means that going back into this position, this is where we had to come up with an improvement, and the improvement was king to F7. So this way we can get the rook out a little bit faster, but we're also not leaving the E6 square behind, just in case they try to go knight D4 and try to take advantage of that. So in this particular game, which let's see, this particular opponent was rated 2100 and 20, or I'm sorry, no, this opponent was rated 1800 rather. So here they go for an attack on whatever is weak. However, they can all rejoin themselves. And again, we have the isolated king pawn here, which isn't really great, but we still have this bishop pair, which is good. Rook to D8, white completes development, and we can use our king to defend the pawn. Now, one of the points here is that if white takes on H7, then we have the possibility of playing rook to H8 and reacquiring the pawn. There also might be a rook takes rook followed by g6, which actually traps the bishop. So there might be a couple of possibilities there, which is why white didn't take on h7. Rook to e3, trying to utilize black's outer space king as a target. Bishop to g4, trying to slow that down. f3, so this wins a tempo, but now rook f3 is off. Bishop to e6. And then in this position, this particular opponent played king c2. Actually, this was the 2100. This was not 1600. This was the 2100 player. And here he plays king c2, which looks like it coordinates his entire position, but it runs into a tactic of rook takes. And then after rook takes, bishop takes c4. And this is now two bishops versus a rook. And this was actually another really, really long game, which I eventually won in the end game with the two pieces for the rook. But and then the final game that we will go over is an eight. This is the 1600 player, where in this position, instead of castling, white tried a different plan altogether with bishop to without castling. They tried bishop to e2, bishop to e6, so we get this move for free now, and then castle. So this is a little bit different because, I mean, castling queenside, of course, gives white an immediately good rook, but maybe the king is a little bit drafty there. Here on the king side, the king is much better placed. I still stuck with my king to f7 move, knight to d4, and here we chose to save the bishop pair just by simply centralizing. Rook he1, rook he8, bishop f1, bishop b6. So both sides are reforming their position. And here again, we have a model of coordination. We've got greatly centralized pieces. Our king is reasonably safe. We got our pawn back. I don't know. This looks like a fun position to me. And after rook a d1, I played g5 and started a general assault on the king side, and white backed up. And this was also another long game, which I eventually won in the end game. This doesn't really have so much to do with the opening, but we did end up getting this position out of the opening, which I can fully say that black has got a very excellent game here. So all right, so we'll just end it with that. This was quite long and a lot of games and a lot to absorb. As usual, I am Bleorg at Lee Chess, BLEEORG. So if you want to message me with your games, we can do a future video on viewers' games with this particular line. This has been Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and I will see you guys on the next one.